The scent of ripening grapes lingered in the warm afternoon air as Aurora moved through the grand dining hall of Villa Romano, polishing the last of the crystal glasses. The estate was a masterpiece of Tuscan elegance, arched ceilings, walls the color of sun-baked terracotta, long windows that framed rolling hills lined with vineyards. Everything about it whispered wealth, refinement, tradition. Everything about it felt like a world she did not belong to. She had been here for 3 years, long enough to know the rhythms of the estate, the unspoken rules of working in a place like this. Keep your head down, do your job, and never, under any circumstances, cross Matteo Romano. He was brilliant, they all said. He was a visionary, a man whose name was spoken with admiration across the wine industry. He had taken the vineyard from his father's old-school methods and elevated it into an empire. People wrote about him in glossy magazines, called him the king of wine, the master of terroir. But the people who worked for him knew him as something else. Demanding. Relentless. Cold. Aurora had never seen him smile. Not really. He had a way of looking at you that made you feel like every flaw, every weakness, every inadequacy was laid bare before him. Which was why she had made it a rule to never, under any circumstances, draw his attention. She needed this job. Needed the stability it gave her. Luca was starting school soon, and she had promised him a life where he never had to worry about things like rent or food or why his mother worked so late. The afternoon light streamed in through the windows, catching the crystal and sending tiny prisms of color scattering across the tablecloths. The dining hall was nearly ready for the evening's event, the estate's most prestigious night of the year, the annual wine selection launch. People flew in from all over for this. Wine critics, collectors, sommeliers, restaurateurs. The kind of people who swirled glasses and spoke about undertones of tobacco and sun-warmed leather. The kind of people who spent more on a single bottle than Aurora had in her entire bank account. She hummed softly as she worked, an old melody she barely thought about anymore. The sound of it filled the empty dining hall, mingling with the clink of glass and the faint breeze from the open terrace doors. Her voice was something she rarely used now, except in the quiet moments before Luca fell asleep, or when she was alone like this, where no one could hear. She had been someone else once. A girl with a voice people stopped to listen to. A girl with dreams. But dreams didn't buy groceries. They didn't pay for doctor's visits. They didn't put shoes on a growing boy's feet. The notes slipped from her lips without effort, a song she had loved as a child, one her grandmother used to sing as they walked through the markets of Florence. It was warm and familiar, a piece of something she had lost but never quite let go of. She barely heard the footsteps at first. Slow. Measured. Then stopping altogether. Aurora turned, and there he was, standing in the doorway. Matteo Romano. He had the kind of presence that silenced a room without trying. Dark hair, always perfectly in place. Sharp cheekbones. The crisp lines of his tailored suit spoke of effortless wealth, but there was nothing effortless about him. He was precision and discipline wrapped in expensive fabric. Aurora swallowed, setting down the glass she had been holding. "You're paid to set tables, not to audition," he said, his voice smooth but edged with something she couldn't quite place. Heat flushed up her neck. "I wasn't," she started, but his gaze cut into her, and she stopped. "You weren't what?" He stepped forward, slowly, like he had all the time in the world to dismantle whatever excuse she was about to make. "I wasn't auditioning." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I was just polishing glasses." His eyes flicked to the table, the perfectly arranged stemware. "And singing." Aurora inhaled carefully, keeping her expression neutral. "It won't happen again." There was a beat of silence, heavy between them. Outside, a tractor rumbled softly in the vineyards, distant but steady. He exhaled, slow and deliberate. "I don't pay you to sing," he said finally. "You can dream on your own time. While you're here, work." It wasn't the words that stung. It was the way he said them, like dreaming itself was an inconvenience. Like the very idea of wanting something beyond this was foolish. Aurora nodded, pressing her lips together. He studied her for a moment longer, then turned without another word, disappearing down the hallway. She let out a slow breath. She had known better. She had been so careful, so disciplined about keeping that part of herself locked away. And for what? A moment of carelessness, a few notes slipping out when she wasn't thinking? She looked down at her hands, still clutching the polishing cloth, fingers trembling slightly. Dream on your own time. It had been years since anyone told her something she didn't already know. Later that evening, as the estate buzzed with preparations, Aurora did her best to avoid crossing paths with him again. She kept to her duties, making sure every glass, every plate, every polished piece of silverware was in its place. The other staff moved around her in careful coordination, the quiet dance of an event like this coming together. From the terrace, she caught glimpses of the vineyards bathed in twilight, the sky streaked in shades of rose and amber. This place was beautiful, there was no denying that. It was the kind of beauty that made people forget everything else, the kind that made you think, for just a second, that anything was possible. But Aurora knew better. The sound of laughter echoed from the far end of the hall, staff murmuring in hushed tones as they worked. Somewhere in the kitchen, the chefs were barking orders, the scent of fresh basil and roasted garlic filling the air. The guests would be arriving soon, dressed in their finest, ready to sip and swirl and make deals over glasses of wine older than she was. She straightened a table setting, adjusting a fork that was already perfectly aligned. This was where she belonged now. Not on a stage. Not in a spotlight. She turned as one of the other servers approached, a tray of glasses balanced expertly in his hands. "You okay?" he asked, lowering his voice. Aurora managed a small smile. "Yeah." He hesitated, then nodded, moving past her. She exhaled and glanced toward the hall where Matteo had disappeared earlier. She had no idea what it was like to be him. To grow up in a world where expectations ruled everything, where there was no room for anything but perfection. But she knew what it was like to give up a dream. And maybe, just maybe, that was something he understood, too. The scent of ripening grapes and freshly turned soil drifted through the air as Matteo Romano stepped onto the villa's terrace, his gaze sweeping over the vineyards below. The morning sun stretched long shadows across the rows of vines, their leaves shimmering with dew, the rich scent of earth and fermenting fruit mixing into something that should have felt like home. It should have been a satisfying sight, the result of years of discipline and work. Instead, it felt like a weight pressing against his chest. The estate was a machine, each piece moving in careful precision. It had to be. Perfection was not an aspiration, it was the only acceptable outcome. And yet, despite the flawless facade, Matteo felt something beneath his skin, an itch he couldn't scratch, a restlessness he couldn't shake. Villa Romano's annual wine selection event was only hours away, and the estate buzzed with preparation. The air was thick with the scent of roasted garlic and fresh basil drifting from the kitchens, the quiet hum of staff voices, the measured clink of crystal and polished silverware. Inside the grand hall, the long tables gleamed beneath the high arched ceilings, rows of wine glasses arranged with meticulous care. Matteo adjusted the cuffs of his shirt, irritation flickering beneath his carefully composed exterior. He had inherited this estate, this legacy, with the full weight of expectation pressing against his spine. His father had spent a lifetime crafting this vineyard into something revered, something untouchable. When he died, the responsibility had passed to Matteo like a crown of iron. And he had taken it. With precision. With control. There had never been another choice. But it hadn't always been like this. Once, before wine barrels and endless meetings, before his life had been measured in vintages and profit margins, he had wanted something different. He had wanted to design. He could still remember the feeling, the quiet hum of creativity, the scratch of pencil against paper as he sketched out plans, dreaming of things he would one day build. Architecture had fascinated him, not just buildings, but space, the way a room could shape the way someone felt. He had studied design in secret, collecting magazines, filling notebooks with blueprints and ideas. He had imagined himself somewhere else, in a world where he built things of his own making, where he didn't have to be his father's son. But dreams had never been part of the Romano legacy. His father had crushed the idea before it ever had a chance to take root. Romano men do not waste their time on childish fantasies, he had said, tossing Matteo's sketches aside like they were nothing more than scraps of paper. You were born to run this estate. That is your purpose. And so, Matteo had done what was expected of him. He had abandoned the foolishness of design and turned his mind toward the vineyard. He had buried himself in the business, learning every inch of it, understanding the land, the grapes, the fermentation process, the way the weather dictated everything. He had become what was needed. And in doing so, he had hardened. Discipline had become his armor. Perfection, his only acceptable outcome. Some called him relentless. Others called him ruthless. He did not care. Weakness had no place in this world, and sentiment was a luxury he refused to indulge. A voice carried through the open terrace doors, quiet but clear. He turned slightly, his gaze narrowing as he recognized it. Aurora. She was setting the dining hall, moving with careful precision as she adjusted the glassware, making sure every detail was exactly as it should be. He could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she kept her head down, her movements measured, calculated to go unnoticed. The preparations moved forward with a steady urgency, every staff member operating like a cog in a well-oiled machine. The kitchen was a symphony of motion, chefs calling out orders, the rhythmic chopping of herbs, the hiss of olive oil hitting hot pans. The scent of fresh bread drifted through the air, mingling with the sharper aroma of balsamic reduction and aged cheese. Outside, workers bustled between the vineyard and the main estate, setting up lanterns along the stone pathways, adjusting the lighting to ensure the villa looked effortlessly enchanting when the guests arrived. The waitstaff moved in quiet coordination, double-checking each table setting, making sure the gold-embossed menus were placed at perfect angles. Every detail mattered. There was no room for error, not under Matteo's watch. Aurora moved carefully through the chaos, keeping to the edges, ensuring that she was useful but unseen. She slipped past the sommeliers discussing last-minute wine pairings, avoided the kitchen entrance where Matteo might pass through, and kept her focus strictly on the tasks in front of her. She spoke only when necessary, nodding in acknowledgement when the head server gave instructions, stepping quickly out of the way when Matteo strode through the dining area, his sharp gaze scanning for anything less than perfection. She knew better than to meet his eyes. It was a game she had played since the moment she had been hired: stay invisible, stay out of his way, and never, ever invite his attention. And yet, despite her best efforts, she could feel it. The weight of his presence. The awareness that, somehow, he was watching. She had been careful all morning. Avoiding him. Matteo smirked. He hadn't expected to be curious about her. She was just another employee, one of dozens who worked beneath him, one of many faces that blended into the estate's carefully maintained order. But then, there had been the night before, when he had caught her singing. She had been careless, unaware of his presence, her voice slipping into the air as if it belonged there. And then, when she had seen him, when he had reminded her of exactly where she stood, there had been no argument, no defiance. Just quiet acceptance. That had intrigued him. He didn't like being intrigued. Curiosity was a distraction, and distractions led to weakness. And yet, here he was, watching her. A thought crept into his mind, slow and deliberate. He decided, in that moment, that he would put her in her place. Not cruelly. Not in any obvious way. That wasn't his style. He preferred something more subtle, more calculated. A reminder of who he was, of who she was. She would not forget her place again. He would make sure of it. But not yet. Matteo turned, his footsteps measured as he moved through the hall, his presence enough to send a quiet ripple through the staff as they scrambled to ensure everything was perfect. He would wait. Let her wonder. The dining hall at Villa Romano glowed under the soft shimmer of chandeliers, casting golden light across the elegantly set tables. Rows of crystal glasses caught the flickering glow of candlelight, reflecting tiny sparks against the deep burgundy of the estate's finest wines. The guests, a collection of critics, collectors, and industry elites, spoke in low, polished tones, their laughter curling through the air like smoke. Every detail of the evening had been curated to perfection, down to the imported linens and the perfectly timed courses. Aurora moved between the tables, balancing a tray with careful precision, her hands steady despite the undercurrent of exhaustion that came from working since early morning. The scent of rosemary and seared lamb wafted from the kitchen, blending with the oak and cherry notes of the wines being poured. This was not the kind of dinner where people ate in haste. Every sip, every bite, every pairing was meant to be savored. And Matteo Romano had ensured that his guests would do exactly that. She kept her head down, weaving between tables, refilling glasses, avoiding the pointed glances of those who barely registered the staff beyond their ability to serve. The evening was progressing without incident, and that, to her, was a victory. No mistakes. No attention drawn to herself. Just another night at the villa, another paycheck secured. Then Matteo spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen, before we continue with our final course, I'd like to offer you something special. An unexpected pairing, if you will." His voice, smooth as the wines he so meticulously crafted, carried effortlessly over the room. The subtle clinking of silverware against porcelain quieted as heads turned toward him. Aurora froze mid-step. "Our lovely server, Aurora, has a talent beyond simply setting a perfect table," he continued, his lips curving in amusement. "Tonight, she will be giving us a musical performance." A ripple of polite intrigue spread through the crowd. Some guests exchanged glances, others leaned forward with the kind of detached curiosity reserved for unexpected entertainment at social events. Aurora's stomach dropped. It took her brain a moment to process what had just happened. It didn't make sense. This wasn't part of the evening's agenda. This wasn't something she had agreed to. This was. Matteo's eyes met hers from across the room. He knew exactly what he was doing. Heat crawled up her neck, a mix of panic and disbelief. He was toying with her, dragging her into the center of an evening that had nothing to do with her. He had done this on purpose. Her pulse pounded in her ears as the guests turned to look at her, waiting. She swallowed. I don't. "Don't be shy, Aurora," Matteo said smoothly, his expression unreadable, though there was something sharp behind his gaze, something that made her blood burn. "I heard you singing earlier. I think everyone here would appreciate a bit of music to accompany the wine." Aurora's throat tightened. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, the judgment, the expectations, the amusement from those who sensed her hesitation. This was his way of putting her in her place. She could refuse. Walk away. But that would be worse. Matteo was a man who thrived on control. He had set this up knowing she couldn't say no. And if she refused now, if she made this awkward, if she somehow embarrassed him in front of his guests. She forced in a breath, steadying herself even as her hands trembled. For a few unbearable seconds, the room remained still. Then, without another word, she stepped forward. The pianist, who had been playing soft instrumental pieces throughout the evening, looked at her uncertainly. She gave him the name of a song, her voice quieter than she intended. He nodded, his fingers finding the keys. The melody began, soft and slow. Aurora's hands clenched into fists at her sides. She could feel her pulse in her throat, the nerves clamping down like a vice. She opened her mouth, but the sound barely came, her voice a whisper, too fragile, too thin. Mateo watched her. She cleared her throat and forced herself to continue. The first few notes wavered, uncertain. But then, something shifted. The music carried her, pushed past the fear, past the suffocating weight of so many eyes on her. She focused on the sound, on the way the song curled around the room, wrapping itself between the candlelight and the wine, between the whispers of fabric and the hushed murmurs. She let go. And the room changed. The laughter stopped. The conversations halted. Her voice, once hesitant, found its footing, blooming into something rich, something effortless. It wasn't just sound. It was feeling. Mateo leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping idly against the stem of his wine glass. She reached the chorus, and the silence in the room thickened, heavy with something she couldn't name. She wasn't singing for them. Not for Mateo. She was singing because she remembered what it felt like to be her. The final note hung in the air, delicate and lingering before it faded into quiet. For a second, there was nothing. Then, applause. It wasn't the restrained, polite clapping of guests acknowledging a scheduled performer. It was genuine. Warm. A swell of appreciation from people who had not expected to be moved. Aurora's breath hitched, her pulse still racing. She barely registered the applause, the way some guests were already murmuring to each other in admiration. Her hands felt cold. She turned away from the piano, stepping back, needing distance from the moment, from the way it had unraveled everything she had tried so hard to keep hidden. Mateo was still watching her. There was something in his expression, something unreadable, something that made her stomach twist. He hadn't expected this. She ignored the way his lips curled ever so slightly, as if he had won something. Without another glance, she walked off, pushing past the waitstaff, past the murmurs of guests who wanted to speak to her, past the warmth of their admiration. Her mind raced. This was not how tonight was supposed to go. The villa was quieter now. The last of the guests had trickled out, their laughter and lingering conversations fading into the night. The dining hall, which had once been filled with the clinking of glasses and the warm hum of conversation, now stood almost still, the only sounds coming from the staff as they cleared away the remnants of an evening that had not gone as Aurora had expected. She moved on autopilot, stacking plates, folding napkins, wiping down tables, anything to keep her hands busy, anything to stop herself from thinking too much. But her mind wouldn't settle. She could still feel it. The way the music had wrapped around her, the way it had shifted the air in the room, the way people had looked at her afterward, like she was someone worth noticing. Not just a server, not just another blurred figure in the background of an evening meant for people with real futures. She was trying to shake it off when a voice cut through the quiet. "You have an incredible gift, you know." Aurora turned, startled, her pulse still unsteady from the events of the night. A man stood near one of the tables, casually sipping from a glass of wine as if he had all the time in the world. Lorenzo Rossi. She had recognized him earlier, of course. Everyone in the industry knew who he was. He had an ear for talent, a name that carried weight in the music world, especially among classical and jazz musicians. He had discovered voices that now filled concert halls, had shaped careers with the same ease that others might pour a glass of wine. He was here tonight as a guest of Mateo, she had assumed, another important man in a room filled with them. And now, he was looking at her like she was the only person in the room. Thank you," she said hesitantly, unsure what else to say. He smiled, easy, unhurried. "I wasn't expecting that tonight," he admitted, swirling the wine in his glass. "I don't think anyone was. But once you started, it was impossible not to listen." She shifted, uncomfortable with the attention. "I don't usually sing in front of people anymore," she admitted, glancing toward the door as if she could escape the conversation if she wanted to. "Shame," Lorenzo said. "Because you should." Her stomach twisted. She wasn't sure what she had been expecting him to say, but somehow, this was worse. It was one thing to lose yourself in a moment, to let something slip out when you weren't thinking. It was another thing entirely to have someone like him see it, name it, make it real. Before she could find a way to brush it off, he set his glass down and reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a sleek black card. I'm putting together a recording project. A collaboration between emerging talents, new voices with something real to say. I'd like you to be part of it. Aurora stared at the card like it was something foreign, something impossible. She didn't take it. Not yet. You don't have to decide right now, he said, his voice patient. Think about it. She nodded, but even as she did, she already knew the war that was about to start in her own mind. Lorenzo gave her a knowing look, as if he could already see the hesitation creeping into her thoughts. A voice like yours, it doesn't just disappear, he said. It waits. And eventually, it demands to be heard again. She swallowed hard. Then he was gone, leaving the card on the table. Aurora didn't touch it right away. She didn't trust herself to. The next morning, she still hadn't made up her mind. She stood at the small kitchen counter of her apartment, pouring cereal into a bowl while Lucas sat at the table, kicking his legs against the chair. The familiar hum of their morning routine should have been comforting, grounding, but her mind kept drifting. Luca, oblivious to her inner turmoil, crunched his cereal and swung his spoon in the air like a conductor's baton. You were singing last night, he said suddenly, looking up at her with wide, curious eyes. She hesitated mid-pour. You heard that? He nodded. I wasn't sleeping yet. You sounded really pretty. Something inside her cracked, just a little. She smiled and ruffled his hair. Eat your breakfast. But the words sat with her all day. By the afternoon, she had picked up Lorenzo's card at least a dozen times, turning it over in her hands, running her thumb over the raised letters like the answer might somehow be buried in the ink. She wanted to say yes. God, she wanted to say yes. But wanting something and allowing yourself to have it were two very different things. She had learned that the hard way. There had been a time when music had been everything to her. She had grown up singing in local festivals, small stages that felt enormous at the time, the kind of places where neighbors clapped and people you barely knew told you that you were destined for something more. And for a while, she had believed them. She had chased the dream, let herself imagine a life beyond the small towns, beyond the reality of what was expected. She had sung in competitions, had saved every extra cent she could to take lessons, had mapped out a future where she was more than just another girl with a pretty voice. Then she had found out she was pregnant. And everything had stopped. She hadn't regretted choosing Luca. Not for a second. But she had understood, in an instant, that her life was no longer just her own. Dreams required risk. They required selfishness. And single mothers didn't have that luxury. There had been nights when she'd lain awake, staring at the ceiling of her tiny apartment, thinking about the version of herself that never had to stop singing. That girl had been fearless, stepping onto makeshift stages at summer festivals, gripping the microphone like it was a lifeline, letting her voice rise above the crowd. She had felt untouchable in those moments, weightless, as if nothing could tether her to the ground. People had told her she had something special, and she had believed them. She had imagined moving to Florence, maybe even Milan, finding a way to sing in real venues, on stages that didn't have blinking carnival lights in the background. But reality had intervened quickly. The moment she saw 2 pink lines on a test she could barely afford, the music had faded into something distant, something that belonged to another life. She had been 19, standing in a too-bright pharmacy, her entire future shifting beneath her feet. Her parents had been disappointed, not cruel but resigned, already seeing the road she would have to take. The music lessons stopped. The festival invitations went unanswered. She took a job at a cafe, working long shifts on her feet while Luca grew inside her, his existence becoming the only thing that mattered. She had no regrets, not about him, never about him, but she had learned to swallow her dreams like medicine, convincing herself they were indulgences she couldn't afford. Even after he was born, there had been moments, small, fragile moments, when she had wondered if she could still find her way back. A customer at the cafe had overheard her humming once and told her she should audition for something. An old friend had sent her a message about an open mic night. But she had always found a reason to say no. She told herself she was too busy, too tired, too practical. And when those excuses felt too thin, she told herself something else, that it was better not to try at all than to try and fail. Because if she stepped onto a stage again and found that the magic was gone, that the girl she had once been was lost for good, what then? She had made peace with it. She had folded that part of herself away and done what needed to be done. But now, Lorenzo's offer sat on her table, staring back at her like a door she hadn't realized was still there. And she didn't know whether to open it or walk away. 3 days passed before she made her decision. She had gone over it again and again, weighing every possibility, every risk. She had nearly talked herself out of it a dozen times. But every time she tried to put it away, she remembered Luca's voice, the simple way he had said it. "You sounded really pretty." And maybe, just maybe, she wanted him to grow up believing that dreams didn't have to be something you buried. She took a deep breath, picked up her phone, and dialed the number on the card. "Mr. Rossi?" "Aurora," Lorenzo's voice came through smoothly, as if he had been expecting her call. "I was wondering when I'd hear from you." She exhaled, her grip tightening on the phone. "I'll do it." There was a pause, then the sound of a satisfied chuckle. "Good," he said. "You won't regret it." She wished she could be as sure. Because the truth was, she was excited. And terrified. But for the first time in a long time, she was choosing something for herself. The morning started like all the others had in the past few weeks, too early, too rushed, and with a headache already brewing before Aurora even had a chance to sip her coffee. Luca sat at the small kitchen table, kicking his legs against the chair as he spooned cereal into his mouth, half watching a cartoon playing on the cracked screen of her phone. His backpack was already packed, shoes set neatly by the door, a small miracle considering how chaotic their mornings had become. Aurora stirred sugar into her coffee, staring at the clock above the sink. She had exactly 14 minutes before they needed to be out the door, 26 minutes before she needed to catch the bus, and just under an hour before her shift started at the vineyard. After that, a long day of setting tables, serving guests, pretending her body wasn't aching from rehearsals the night before. And once her shift was over, she would run straight to Lorenzo's studio, where she'd have to find a way to push past the exhaustion and sing like she wasn't running on fumes. This was her life now. A careful balancing act that required more energy than she had to give. She wasn't sure how much longer she could keep it up. By the time she got Luca to school and made it to the vineyard, she already felt like she had lived an entire day. The estate was bustling, workers tending to the vines, guests arriving for private tastings, staff moving in orchestrated precision to ensure everything ran smoothly. Aurora barely had time to catch her breath before diving into her tasks, grabbing a tray, forcing a smile, keeping up the illusion that she wasn't barely holding herself together. Aurora's days became an endless loop of motion, her body operating on autopilot while her mind struggled to keep up. Every day she woke before dawn, her alarm cutting through the silence of her tiny apartment, and by the time her feet hit the cold floor, exhaustion already weighed her down. She rushed Luca through breakfast, packed his lunch, and walked him to school with a quick kiss to his forehead before sprinting to the bus stop. At the vineyard, she moved through her shifts with the kind of detached efficiency that came from sheer survival, setting tables, serving guests, hauling trays heavy with expensive wine she could never afford to taste. The hours dragged, and by the time her shift ended, she barely had enough time to gulp down a coffee before heading straight to rehearsal. The studio was small, tucked away in a quiet part of town, a space meant for creation. But there was no luxury in it for her. No indulgence. It was work, just a different kind. Lorenzo pushed her, corrected her posture, made her repeat notes over and over until her throat burned. She forced herself to stay present, to focus, to ignore the way her body ached from moving too much, sleeping too little. She wanted this. She needed this. But wanting something and surviving something were two very different things. By the time she got home at night, Luca was usually asleep, curled up on the couch with a book still open on his lap. She would carry him to bed, brush his hair back from his forehead, and whisper apologies into the dark. Then she would collapse onto her own bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on her. There was no relief, no pause. Just the knowledge that in a few short hours, it would start all over again. Matteo Romano was not a man who often concerned himself with the movements of his staff. He expected excellence, demanded it, but he rarely involved himself in the details of who did what. Which was why it was particularly frustrating that he found himself noticing Aurora. He had tried to shake it off, that night in the dining hall. It had been an impulse, a moment of amusement. He had expected her to shrink, to falter, to remind herself of where she stood in the hierarchy of this estate. Instead, she had done the opposite. And that had been irritating. It wasn't just her voice, though there was no denying that it was remarkable. It was the way she had controlled the room without trying, the way she had commanded attention without demanding it. He had spent his entire life perfecting that skill, understanding the balance between presence and power. And she had done it with nothing but a song. It had unsettled something in him. Matteo was not a man who dwelled on emotions. He didn't allow distractions. And yet, here he was, irritated that a server had managed to take up space in his mind. He learned about the recording project 2 days later. It was mentioned in passing, a casual remark from one of his staff members as they went over scheduling changes. Aurora was joining a collaboration under Lorenzo Rossi's direction, some project for emerging talent. Something about it set his teeth on edge. There was a difference between raw talent and something refined. Between natural ability and true discipline. He had seen plenty of people chase dreams they were not equipped to handle. The world was full of people who thought passion was enough. It never was. And yet, Aurora seemed determined. He could see it in the way she worked, pushing through exhaustion, never slacking, never allowing herself a moment of reprieve. He saw it in the way she left at the end of her shifts, shoulders squared despite how tired she clearly was. That should have been enough. That should have convinced him that this was not his concern. Instead, he found himself making a small adjustment to the weekly schedule. A few extra shifts. A few longer nights. Nothing that could be called unfair. Just enough to remind her where she belonged. Matteo watched it all unfold with quiet satisfaction. He didn't acknowledge it outright, didn't speak of it, but he was aware of every shift she took, every late night she endured. She had made a mistake in assuming she could balance both worlds. Talent was one thing, but discipline? That was something else entirely. He had learned that the hard way, had sacrificed everything to maintain control over his own life. If she thought she could have both, she was mistaken. So he continued. An extra shift added to the weekend roster. A sudden request for her to assist at a private tasting event. Longer hours in the dining hall, ensuring that by the time she left the vineyard, she had nothing left to give. He watched her closely, waiting for the moment she would crack, the moment she would realize that dreams came second to reality. Aurora noticed immediately. But she didn't crack. She showed up, even when exhaustion painted shadows under her eyes. She kept working, kept rehearsing, kept pushing through the exhaustion with a quiet, stubborn determination that irritated him more than he wanted to admit. He saw it in the way she refused to slow down, in the way she gritted her teeth and got through each shift, in the way she never gave him the satisfaction of complaining. She wasn't giving up. No matter how hard he made it, no matter how little time she had left for herself, she refused to let him win. She stood in the staff quarters, staring at the new schedule, her stomach twisting. She was already stretched thin. And now, more shifts, less time, fewer hours to sleep, to breathe. Mateo was doing all this on purpose. She could feel it in the deliberate nature of it, in the way he had barely acknowledged her since that night, except in this. It would be easier to quit. To let the weight of it press down on her until she accepted that this was too much. But she wasn't going to. She was going to show up. She was going to sing. And he wasn't going to stop her. The studio smelled like coffee and old wood, the kind of place where creativity hummed in the air, where voices bounced off the walls and lingered long after the music stopped. Aurora sat in the dimly lit recording booth, adjusting the headphones over her ears, fingers gripping the sheet music even though she had memorized every note, every lyric. This was the moment they had been working toward, weeks of rehearsals, of exhaustion, of balancing everything in her life to make this possible. The red recording light flicked on. Lorenzo's voice came through the speakers. Relax. Feel the music, not the pressure. Easy for him to say. He wasn't the one with everything riding on this. The melody started, soft piano chords filling the space, and Aurora inhaled deeply before stepping into the music. The moment she sang, the exhaustion melted away. It was like slipping into another version of herself, one that had been waiting all these years to be let out. The control was there, the emotion woven into every note, the rise and fall of her voice carrying something deeper than words. The sound engineer gave Lorenzo a thumbs up through the glass. They were getting it. By the end of the session, Aurora pulled off her headphones, her heart still racing, hands shaking slightly. She looked at the others, musicians, backup vocalists, people she had barely known a month ago but who had become something close to family. There was a shared energy in the room, a quiet kind of awe that came when something truly worked. Lorenzo grinned, leaning back in his chair. That, he said, was magic. The second recording session was different. The nerves were still there, but they weren't crippling anymore. Aurora stepped into the booth with a little more confidence, her hands steady as she adjusted the microphone height. The musicians had already settled in, the soft murmur of tuning instruments filling the space. She glanced through the glass, catching Lorenzo's approving nod. This was no longer just an experiment. This was happening. The song they were recording today had a different energy, more soul, more weight behind the lyrics. It demanded something deeper, something raw. The first take was solid, but Lorenzo wasn't looking for solid. Again, he said, leaning into the mic on his side of the glass. Don't just sing it. Feel it. She took a breath, closed her eyes, and let go. When the music started again, she didn't think about technique, about how she needed to be perfect. She thought about Luca, about the long nights, about the moment she almost walked away from this entirely. And then, she sang. The shift was immediate. She could feel it in the room, the way the musicians followed her lead, the way Lorenzo sat up straighter in his chair. When the final note faded, there was a charged silence. Then, through the speaker, Lorenzo's voice, "That's the take." Listening back later, Aurora barely recognized herself. It was her voice, her emotion, but it felt bigger, more complete. The layers of harmonies, the way the piano curled around the melody, the quiet power behind each note, it wasn't just a song. It was her. The song was released a week later. Aurora didn't have time to think about it. She was too busy moving between shifts at the vineyard and running to rehearsals. She had no idea how far it would reach, didn't expect much beyond a handful of people listening. But then something strange happened. People heard it. Not just a few, but thousands. The launch happened quietly at first. Lorenzo had connections, but even he knew that success in the music industry wasn't instant. The song went up on streaming platforms, accompanied by a simple post, a new collaboration featuring fresh voices. No major promotions, no flashy headlines. Just the music, sent into the world like a message in a bottle, waiting to see if anyone would find it. But then, something unexpected happened. People listened. And then they listened again. A small jazz cafe in Rome added it to their weekend playlist, and soon, other venues followed. Someone uploaded a clip to social media, a short video of a couple slow dancing to Aurora's voice, captioned, "This song feels like a dream." It started spreading, more shares, more comments, more people asking, "Who is she? Where can I hear more?" Lorenzo called her one evening, excitement barely contained in his voice. "You won't believe this," he said. "We just got a request for a live performance. A real one. They want you." She had been standing in her tiny kitchen, stirring pasta for Luca's dinner, and the words had nearly made her drop the spoon. A real performance. Not just singing into a microphone in a quiet studio, but standing on a stage, in front of people, being seen. More opportunities followed. A feature in an independent music blog praised the song for its haunting quality, for the way Aurora's voice carried something rare, honesty, vulnerability, the kind of presence that couldn't be manufactured. A well-known radio host mentioned it during a late-night program, and overnight, the streams doubled. The song had taken on a life of its own, slipping beyond her control, reaching places she had never dared to imagine. And yet, through all of it, Aurora still went to work at the vineyard every day. She still tied her apron, set the tables, kept her head down. The success felt surreal, like something happening to another version of herself, one she had yet to fully believe in. The music world was calling her name, louder and louder, but Matteo Romano had made sure that she was too exhausted to answer. Matteo heard the song by accident. He had been working in his office late one evening, reviewing vineyard reports, when a familiar voice filtered in through the open window. One of the kitchen staff must have been playing music on their phone, a violation of his strict rules about distractions during work hours, but that wasn't what made him stop mid-sentence. It was her. Aurora's voice, rich and effortless, weaving through the speakers like it had always belonged there. He sat back, exhaling slowly, trying to ignore the way his chest tightened. It was good. He hated that it was good. He hated even more that it stirred something in him, something he had spent years trying to bury. She had no right, to make it look so easy. It had taken him years to perfect his craft, to shape the Romano vineyard into what it was. He had given up everything for it, abandoned his own dreams, buried them under duty and responsibility. And yet, here she was, slipping through the cracks he had so carefully sealed, proving that some people could just step into their dreams while others had to sacrifice theirs. The resentment settled deep. Matteo didn't acknowledge the song, not directly. But Aurora could feel his response in the way her schedule became even more punishing. Last-minute shifts appeared without warning, turning what was already a grueling routine into something nearly impossible. She barely had time to breathe, let alone rehearse, and when she dragged herself into the studio after a long day at the vineyard, her voice was raw with exhaustion. Lorenzo noticed. "You're running yourself into the ground," he told her, arms crossed as she fought to stay awake between takes. "This isn't sustainable." But quitting wasn't an option. Matteo's game was obvious now. He was testing her, waiting to see how much she could take before she broke. It wasn't enough that she showed up. He wanted her to fail. To come crawling back, admitting she couldn't do both. But she refused to give him that satisfaction. She pushed through, forcing herself to focus even when her mind begged for rest. And Matteo? He watched. He saw how she moved slower, how she massaged her aching wrists when she thought no one was looking. He saw the way fatigue weighed her down, yet somehow, she never gave up. And that, more than anything, infuriated him. Aurora felt the shift immediately. Her name appeared on extra shifts that weren't originally scheduled, long hours that stretched into exhaustion. There was no denying it, Matteo was doing this on purpose. But he had underestimated something. She wasn't giving up. She worked through every shift, every grueling hour. And when the night came, and the stage called, she sang anyway. The evening air was thick with the scent of wine and rosemary as the villa buzzed with the kind of quiet opulence that came with wealth and power. The guests, a carefully curated mix of vineyard investors, critics, and high-profile collectors, sipped from crystal glasses, murmuring in polished voices about the year's best vintages. Servers weaved through the crowd with practiced ease, carrying trays of perfectly paired appetizers, the entire event choreographed down to the last detail. Aurora moved through the dining hall, balancing a tray of wine glasses, her steps light but purposeful. She had worked enough of these events to know her role, blend into the background, anticipate the needs of the guests before they even asked, and above all, avoid Matteo Romano's gaze. She was still recovering from the past few weeks, the exhaustion settling deep in her bones, but she was here, still standing, still pushing forward. She was setting down a glass when she heard it. "Wait a second," a man's voice said from the other side of the table. "I know you." Aurora froze. Slowly, she turned to see an older gentleman studying her with interest, his expression shifting from curiosity to certainty. His name tag read Carlo Bianchi, a well-known music journalist. "You're the singer from the Lorenzo Rossi project," he continued, snapping his fingers as he searched for the name. "Aurora. You sang Alter la Notte." Several heads turned in her direction. Aurora felt a wave of heat rise up her neck. She forced a polite smile. Yes, I was part of the project." Carlo's excitement only grew. "Your voice is spectacular. That song, unbelievable. I've been telling everyone it's one of the best releases this year." A few guests murmured in agreement. Someone else at the table nodded. "I heard it, too. Beautiful work." Another guest, a woman with elegantly pinned hair and an air of effortless confidence, set down her glass and smiled. "You should sing it." Aurora's pulse stuttered. The table agreed immediately, voices layering over each other with enthusiasm. "Yes, you must. It would be an honor. We'd love to hear it live." The room suddenly felt too small. She swallowed hard, her grip tightening on the tray. Then she saw him. As the voices began to settle, a familiar voice cut through the lingering admiration. Lorenzo, standing near the back of the room with his usual air of effortless confidence, stepped forward and turned to Matteo with a knowing smile. "Romano, I think it's clear your guests appreciate good music," he said, his tone smooth but pointed. "Perhaps it's time you stop keeping her hidden in the dining hall and let her really sing." There was a flicker of something unreadable in Matteo's expression, annoyance, consideration, something else entirely, but he said nothing. Instead, he simply held Aurora's gaze for a moment longer, as if weighing the possibility that, for once, someone else's dream deserved room to exist. Matteo stood near the entrance, posture rigid, jaw set, his expression unreadable. But she knew better. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand curled into a loose fist at his side. He didn't want this. And yet, he was trapped. To deny the guest's request would make his bias obvious. He had spent years curating these events to perfection, ensuring that everything felt seamless, effortless. If he refused now, if he dismissed their enthusiasm, he would expose himself. Aurora saw the realization flicker across his face. Then, after a pause that felt longer than it was, Matteo gave a sharp nod. Matteo's expression shifted in an instant, his sharp instincts taking over as he turned back to his guests with a wide, effortless smile, the kind that masked everything beneath it. "Of course," he said smoothly, lifting his glass as if this had been his intention all along. "A talent like Aurora's should be shared. What better way to elevate the evening than with another performance?" His voice carried the perfect blend of charm and authority, making it seem as though he had orchestrated this moment rather than been cornered into it. He gestured toward the pianist with an easy grace, the picture of a gracious host, but when his gaze flicked back to Aurora, there was something almost challenging in his eyes. Her heart pounded. A pianist was already stationed in the corner of the room, playing soft background melodies for the evening. Someone gestured toward him, and within moments, the keys shifted, a familiar intro filling the space. Aurora stood frozen. This wasn't a rehearsal. This wasn't a studio. This was real. Then she met Matteo's eyes. Something inside her steadied. She inhaled deeply, closed her eyes, and stepped into the music. The song was slow, aching, the kind of melody that wrapped around a room and made people stop mid-conversation, mid-breath. Her voice started soft, tentative, then built, carrying the weight of every sleepless night, every sacrifice, every doubt she had ever swallowed. The dining hall shifted. The conversation stopped. People turned, drawn in, their glasses suspended in midair, their movements stilled. Aurora let herself go. She sang like she was telling a secret only the music could understand. By the time she reached the final note, the silence was thick, expectant. Then, a moment later, applause. Not polite applause. Not the casual, expected kind. Real, thunderous, undeniable. Aurora's chest rose and fell with each breath, her hands trembling slightly at her sides. The guests stood, some still clapping, some just watching her, as if unsure how to process what had just happened. Matteo hadn't moved. He was still by the entrance, his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. But something was different. Matteo had expected to tolerate the performance, to endure it the way one might sit through an overlong toast or an investor's dull anecdote. But as Aurora began to sing again, something inside him shifted. The room faded. The clinking of glasses, the murmur of conversation, it all fell away. It was just her voice, effortless yet controlled, filled with something raw and real. He recognized it instantly. Passion. The kind that couldn't be taught, the kind that made people forget themselves. It was the same feeling he had once carried, long ago, when he had dreamed of designing, of creating something that mattered beyond profit margins and family expectations. He leaned back slightly, studying her, realizing with something dangerously close to admiration that she wasn't just good. She was exceptional. He saw the way she lost herself in the music, the way her presence stretched beyond the space she physically occupied, how she held the room without trying. He had spent years convincing himself that dreams were a luxury, that some people were meant to sacrifice while others reached for more. And yet, here she was, pushing past exhaustion, past every obstacle he had thrown at her, and proving that talent, when met with persistence, had a way of forcing itself into the world. For the first time, he questioned himself. Had he been trying to teach her discipline, or had he simply been punishing her for something he could never bring himself to do? Had he resented her success, or had he envied her courage? As the final note rang through the dining hall, met with another wave of applause, Matteo didn't join in right away. He simply watched her, feeling the unfamiliar weight of realization settle in his chest. Maybe, just maybe, some dreams were worth making room for. The applause was still echoing through the villa, a warm, resounding wave that carried the weight of something undeniable. Aurora stood at the center of it all, breathless, flushed, her pulse still racing from the song. She had sung before, on small stages, in festivals, in places that barely remembered her name. But this was different. This had been a test, and not just of her talent. It had been a confrontation, a silent battle between her and Matteo, one that neither of them had put into words but had played out between long shifts, exhaustion, and unspoken challenges. Then, just as the applause began to die down, Matteo stepped forward. The movement was so unexpected, so out of place in the structure of the evening, that the room fell silent almost instantly. Matteo Romano did not take the stage. He hosted these events, controlled them with quiet authority, but he never made himself the center of them. Aurora stiffened, her body still humming with adrenaline as he reached the front of the room, pausing just beside her. For a moment, he didn't say anything. He looked out at the guests, at the faces turned toward him, at the glasses of wine forgotten on tables as everyone waited. Then he spoke. "There are moments in life that force us to reconsider what we think we know," he said, his voice steady, though there was something different in it. Something unguarded. "Tonight was one of those moments for me." Aurora swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the microphone she no longer needed. Mateo's gaze shifted to her, and for the first time since she had met him, there was no trace of calculation in his eyes. No cold assessment. No quiet resentment. "I owe you an apology," he said, and the weight of those words was enough to make Aurora's breath hitch. "Not just for the way I've treated you, but for the way I underestimated you." A murmur passed through the room. Matteo Romano did not apologize. But he wasn't done. "You reminded me of something I had forgotten," he continued. "That dreams don't just belong to the lucky. They belong to the ones who fight for them. And you," his voice softened, just slightly. "You have been fighting harder than anyone I know." The silence in the room wasn't uncomfortable. It wasn't heavy with judgment or disbelief. It was quiet with understanding. Aurora stood frozen, caught between the need to speak and the realization that, for once, she didn't have to say anything at all. Then, Matteo turned back to the crowd, exhaling slowly. "Enjoy your evening," he said simply, stepping aside as the murmurs returned, as conversations started up again, as the spell of the moment broke. But the shift between them had already happened. And from that night on, Matteo stopped interfering in her life. The change was subtle at first. A missing shift from her schedule. A night where she was able to leave on time instead of being held back by a sudden, last-minute request. And then, it became something more. No more added stress, no more quiet punishments disguised as managerial decisions. Matteo stepped back, and for the first time since she had started working at the vineyard, it felt like she could breathe. With the weight of his interference lifted, everything else moved quickly. The music project gained traction, live performances became more frequent, and soon, Aurora was at a crossroads she had never let herself imagine. She didn't need the vineyard anymore. She was leaving. The day her resignation was finalized, Aurora lingered outside Matteo's office, her fingers curled into the strap of her bag, unsure of what exactly she was waiting for. It had taken years to build a life here. And now, in a matter of weeks, she was walking away from it. A part of her wondered if he would let her leave without a word. But then, his voice came from inside the office. "Come in." She stepped forward, pushing the door open, expecting, she didn't know. A final critique? An impassive dismissal? Instead, Matteo leaned back in his chair, studying her with something that wasn't quite a smile, but wasn't its usual opposite either. "You're really going, then?" he asked. She nodded. "I am." A pause stretched between them. Then, Matteo exhaled, shaking his head slightly, almost amused. "Good." That caught her off guard. "Good." He folded his hands together on the desk, his gaze steady. "You proved me wrong, Aurora," he admitted. "And that doesn't happen often." She let out a breath of laughter, but there was something thick in her throat, something unexpected. "Thank you," she said, the words simple, but full. Matteo only nodded. "Just don't forget where you started," he said. "And don't be a stranger." And that was that. That night, as she walked into her apartment, exhausted but lighter than she had felt in years, her phone rang. She almost ignored it, assuming it was Lorenzo confirming another performance, but something made her pick up. "Ms. Moretti," a warm voice said on the other end. "This is the administrative office of Bella Vista Academy. We're calling regarding your son, Luca." Aurora's stomach clenched. "Is something wrong?" "Not at all," the woman assured her. "We're simply reaching out to confirm his enrollment. His tuition has been paid in full for the entire duration of his schooling." Aurora's breath caught. "I'm sorry, there must be a mistake," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's no mistake," the woman replied. "Mr. Matteo Romano personally handled the arrangements." Aurora couldn't move. Couldn't speak. There was a knock at her door. She barely remembered walking to it, barely registered opening it, until she was met with one of the vineyard's employees, holding a carefully wrapped box of wine. "A delivery for you," he said with a small smile, passing it to her. Her hands were shaking as she took it. Inside the box, nestled between 2 bottles of the finest wine Villa Romano had to offer, was a note. She unfolded it, her breath catching as she read the words in Matteo's distinct, precise handwriting. "Thank you for reminding me that dreams can come true. Since I tried to complicate yours, I hope through your son's education I can repair some of the damage and help make his dreams come true one day. And I hope you can sing at the vineyard again sometime. Matteo Romano." Aurora pressed the note against her chest, swallowing hard, her heart full of something indescribable. Maybe she would.